just think of them. I think of an organ, and I think of what would happen if that organ stopped working. You know? I think they're funny and interesting, more so than just like 116 controller, blah blah blah. will only get worse, Darkman. This is so slow.
to practice evidence-based care and put people first. Follow your heart to British Columbia, Canada.
You finally found it, the home of your dreams. Except for that one shower. Now it's time.
Like, you used to know exactly what the Republican Party was going to think. Now it's like, what does Trump think? Now I know what the Republican Party is going to think.
I believe a lot of it's just used as a way to get us to not think about our infrastructure issues, to not think about our drinking water having lead in it. If you look at an algorithm assessment of X, the day that Elon Musk announced that when he endorsed Donald Trump, the algorithm started boosting right-wing stuff I mean, like 5 to 1, 6 to 1, 7 to the time that you see somebody on, like, you know, X or somewhere calling someone, you know, the DEI mayor or the DEI CEO or something, many of those cases you could just replace it with the N word and it would mean the exact same thing. Like, there is no difference. When I read the United Healthcare CEO news, like I had this weird crisis, because my first thought was, like a lot of people, I was like, good. Like, that was my first thought, you know? And I was like, whoa, why is this okay to me? And I guess after thinking about it a lot, it's like, what percentage of people in a younger age demographic think that marijuana should be legal, that people shouldn't be busted for marijuana? Or what percentage of people think that, like, we shouldn't have as many middlemen telling us, for-profit middlemen telling us if we can or can't get health care? And like, and we all believe that, and these people vote, and we feel very strongly, and we never get change. And so then eventually somebody votes with their gun, and we actually feel some form of, like, justice served, even though it's not justice at all. But on the other side of that, it sounds very weird to say, but, like, I thought about, like, okay, so after Trump won, how many people, and this is a difficult thing to talk about, but how many people considered committing suicide? Like, how many people, like, so do you want me to?
No, keep going.
Okay.
I'm walking in front of your camera like an asshole. You're good.
How many people, like, think about, like, marginalized people? Like, I have some friends who, like, were very depressed, and not because, like, they're weak-minded, but they were very depressed because they're trans or they're marginalized in a way, and they're like, life's going to be a lot worse now. Things are going to get even worse, whether that's true or not. And in a weird way, it's like, it's almost like a different option. It's like, you could become militarized against this person instead of taking your own life, which is just as risky and hopeless for you. But in a weird way, that feels like hope to some people. Does that make any sense? Am I, like, just...
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, like, you're essentially, like, if something is so bad and the situation is so terrible, it seems like some people are trying to resolve that by suicide, right? And thinking about suicide, whereas others often resolve that by kind of radicalization and mobilization, specifically violent mobilization a lot of the time, because there's very much that feeling that if we can't get anything through, or if we can't get the results that we need through the right sources, then the only option at that point, like, when is political violence justified, right? That's, like, fundamentally like the question. And it feels like there is something, I think a lot of people do feel more hope in, like, that, like, militarized way. It's definitely, like, more hope-pilling, but it's also it's interesting if you look at the demographics of who is going to lean towards being suicidal versus who's going to lean towards, like, radicalization, and probably a lot of the precursors that predict which pathway people are taking.
Well, yeah, I think getting back to kind of where you were talking about, like, you know, we should change the laws and not be angry at the cops. I would say there's instances where we do need to change the laws, but there's also instances where we need to change the way cops behave. Qualified immunity being a good one, right? Like, that is a legitimate reason to want to change policing, to be angry at the way policing is set without being set we do need to change these laws. But when you get into things like the Mangione, the healthcare CEO shooting, I think what it speaks to is, I think what you're saying is hopelessness. Like, people don't feel like they have hope, and they feel like the only way they can express that is either through harm to themselves or harm to other people. And I think that's the kind of lesson that I take from this, is, like, of course I don't condone shooting anybody, I don't condone violence, but I think what we're seeing here is we're seeing a kind of a hopelessness from a lot of people in this country, and they don't know what vehicle there is to improve those things. And I think part of that is our political system is so busted. It's so just hyper partisan. and that people feel like neither fit me, I don't really have a place, there's no way for me to fix this within the legal means, and so they get desperate. And that's what I'm getting out of this whole Mangione thing, is that, you know, and I say this as a libertarian who does not want single payer. I don't want a government take over healthcare. But yeah, our healthcare system sucks, and it provides a lot of misery for a lot of people. And in that system, it's going to create a lot of hopelessness. There's got to be ways we can improve upon that and not shoot at people, to actually improve things. And I think there are things we can do across the spectrum, libertarians and non-libertarians, and all across the spectrum, to make our healthcare system better and not just shoot at people.
I think that one of the big issues is that I argue that I think that our political system is actually incredibly effective. I think what the political system is doing, though, is it's showing like a real division in people. One of my biggest things that I get frustrated with is I feel like sometimes there's a lot of misplaced anger. Like, if there was just a different way of expressing something in our political system, it would be better. But I think that legitimately, it's not like a bunch of Americans are unified on a whole bunch of things, and then the political system is just not having those like bear fruit. I think there's a lot of genuine, huge division in the United States, and I think that gets expressed in our political system. That we think sometimes that we have more union around certain political topics, but we'll like conceptually be in agreement, but then when you start to like iron it out, we're actually in complete and total disagreement. And then what you get is you get a bunch of people who are directing anger at a particular place, and you've got a bunch of people in my field, political pundits and everything else, who are here to monetize anger, because, I mean, let's face it, if you've got friends, like, gossiping about shit is a whole bunch more fun than problem solving or troubleshooting. And then all it is you go on the radio, you go on the YouTube, you go on TV, and you just complain and complain and complain and complain, and then say everything is horrible and terrible, and then you don't give people like a realistic path to change anything. And it's like, of course, like, people are feeling hopeless. Like, it's literally the feeling that you want to breed in people, because it's what's the most easy to monetize. It's not sexy to say like, go out and vote, but it's really sexy to say like, we need to rise up and fight and kill these people and blah blah.
It's one of the things I had to do running for office, is not just say everything sucks. Everything sucks and it's terrible, vote for me. Because nobody does that. Nobody will go, oh, that guy clearly sees that everything sucks, so we should vote for him. No. I would say this is a problem, and here's how we can fix it. And that's how I'd have to run for office, because especially if you're running outside of the two-party system, if you don't have solutions, you don't have ears listening to you. Because people everybody hates taxes. Oh, great, taxation is theft, cool. What are you gonna do about the taxes that are being taken out of pocket, buddy? Or, hey, yeah, war sucks, but what are you gonna do to make the world more peaceful, man? Like, if you don't have the second part of that, you're not doing anything. You're just complaining. You're just putting negativity out in the atmosphere for no good reason, and oftentimes it just creates this kind of siloed thinking.
Scott Alexander, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Slate Star Codex or anything, the writings from him. He's got this really interesting article that's called Criticisms of Criticisms. And he identifies this kind of like cyclical pattern that often occurs in large societal rhetoric, where there's kind of this startup rising criticism that tends to be really low resolution, that embodies an emotional feeling of society. And it's a criticism of a system, and it tends to be really low resolution. And then over time, it'll either get hijacked, but oftentimes he talks about how there might be like a solution. Oftentimes the solution is bad policy. A lot of the time it actually is bad policy that comes out, right? Because it's often very emotionally driven policy. And then there'll be kind of like this lull, and then people will begin to feel frustrated once again, because a lot of time the policy that we have doesn't solve all the problems, but also there is a lot of misattribution of arousal, where people are often looking externally to the government and others around them for the source of their misery, when the source of their misery is probably like their loneliness, lack of meaning, and like their mental health. But one of the things that he brings up in this article is talking about how it's really important to have criticisms that are effective criticisms, right? But nobody wants to stick around for that conversation. It's really, really hard to get into like the nitty-gritty of being like, okay, well, if systemic racism is real within private companies, if that's occurring where people who are culturally maybe not part of the hegemon, they're not culturally as white American, they're getting kind of bypassed in various promotions and stuff. If that's true, how do we see it? How do we find it? Because if there's a way that we can shift it, I think most people would be on board for that. But the work that it takes to kind of parse through all the data and figure out these really subtle problems is incredibly difficult. And I feel like we've solved a lot of the simple problems. in North America. I feel like a lot of the simple problems of like women are dying in birth, like we're like, okay, well, we should get cleanliness and improve our medicine. But now we have problems of being like, okay, well, even though the economy is really, really strong, people feel squeezed because housing is pretty unaffordable and accounting for a larger portion of people's budget than it ever historically has, which is why even though the economy is good and people are making more money than they ever have, they actually feel more monetarily squeezed. But how do you exactly improve that? Because the housing market is really complicated. It's really hard to know the best way to improve that based on like supply and demand.
Yeah, well, two things. One, I will say I love that the simple problems like the basic things like food and sanitation and water, pretty huge things that we have overcome in this country and that we enjoy, that in many places in the rest of the world, they don't have that security, right? That's that kind of North American mindset that we have, like, hey, we turn on a faucet and water comes out most of the time. It's clean water compared to a lot of places. So you're right, we've gotten a lot of the, quote unquote, the simple things done, like the basic building blocks. And now we're arguing over a lot of nuance and you're right. And I think there is no silver bullet for every issue. There's a million ways to solve a problem. And some of those things can be over-engineered and screwed up and ultimately create other problems on the back end, or something can be very streamlined and very direct and fix the problem, but maybe not address other concerns around that problem. There's a lot of different ways to fix things. And I think one of the things we lose when we discuss policy, especially when we get so emotional about it, is that generally, you were saying there's a lot of huge differences between people, but I would argue that most people generally, their interests are nearly the same. They want safety, they want security, they want to see their family do well, and then it's a matter of like, well, how do we view the rest of the world? And that's where the differences come up. And like, for me, I don't know if there's a way to make our politics friendlier. I wish it were, because we might get more things done if we had conversations just like this. Like if elected leaders actually had the ego to go, I'm not right all the time. Maybe I need to sit with people who are different than me and see a different perspective.
Get ready for the best summer day in LA with Universal Mega Movie Summer at
You just don't get that.
That's DEI.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I'll tell you, this is with the wildfires coming up. This is one of the things I have a problem with. Just because the fire chief is a gay woman doesn't mean she's a DEI hire. Now, are there situations where there's quoting and things like that, and you can have a problem with that? Traditionally, that's been a thing. But I'm tired of seeing it used as shorthand. For anybody who just is outside of the traditional norm of the job, well, that must be a DEI hire. No, my black chemistry professor when I was or my black chemistry teacher when I was in high school was not hired because of DEI. He was hired because he was a guy who liked chemistry, and he went to school to teach it, and that's what he did.
Most of the time that you see somebody on X or somewhere calling someone, the DEI mayor or the DEI CEO or something, you could in many of those cases you could just replace it with the N word and it would mean the exact same thing. Like, there is no difference.
Well, for some people, sure. And for some people, I think that they think DEI is in every city and it's this prevalent thing. To me, it's just a different way of saying, like, increase the amount of our workforce and the inclusion of our workforce. Like, it's a different way of doing it, and I understand DEI can mean a whole lot of different things, but for me, it shouldn't mean, hey, there's someone who's a woman doing a job that men traditionally do. That must be DEI Thomas Sowell, when he would argue against affirmative action, would use the idea of, I don't want people to think I'm a college professor because I'm an affirmative action college professor. I did it on my own. I worked really hard at it. And I think it discounts a lot of people who work really hard in a lot of fields who have nothing to do with social policy or politics or anything. They just grew up going, I want to be a firefighter. I don't care if I'm a girl.
Also, like DEI, the way that we're using it in like the way that it's in popular culture right now and the way that it's being villainized, a lot of people don't realize that it's coming from capitalism. It's not necessarily coming from civil rights. Like, there's plenty of economic studies that show that having a DEI program increases profit at the end of the day. Like, and it makes sense. Like, yeah, maybe having a Japanese woman on our force, to her different cultural perspective, will actually add value to our overall workflow and make things more efficient, because she'll think of ideas that all these white dudes couldn't think of. And it's not about being. It has nothing to do with being woke or even doing the right thing.
It's about making money for them.
Right.
For them, it's about making money.
Exactly. And so when you see companies like Meta, like, getting rid of their DEI, it's just like, what are you doing? Like, this isn't
Bowing to
Well,
the
they also
Nobody's forcing you to do this. You're actually making more money from it, especially with something like social media, where that would be actually important because you want to advertise to people from all of these different demographics.
Well, and I would think, market-wise, if it shows that getting rid of that program creates losses or creates lower gains, you wouldn't be surprised to see something like that coming back eventually. Business reacts to dollar money dollar, right? And for me, like, I can tell you a real-world example of a workplace that's very diverse that I worked in. I worked in maritime trade, moving goods from one part of the world to the other. It's very important that we have people from all over the world working in our offices because we are on a 24-hour, the ships never stop moving. They never stop going. The ports never stop. I mean, most ports are 24 hours, not in America, but like goods never stop moving. And so you need to have a workforce from around the world and that can interact with people from around the world. We had people in my office in Atlanta who spoke Mandarin. Why? Because you might have to speak Mandarin to somebody, or Spanish, or French, or whatever. And it's good to have people from around the world who have that cultural insight into what's going on. That was a good thing for my business. Is it good for every business? I don't know, and I wouldn't, and I don't have the answer to everything. But I would argue that seeking out the best people many times is going to involve seeking out many people from many different walks of life who have many different perspectives to create an overall consensus of what's going on, especially if you're a giant multinational corporation. If you're a corporation that's got your hands in pots all over the world, it kind of is in your interest and will make you money to do that. So I don't think it all the time is this nefarious woke thing. I just don't. Now that being said, hire the best people for the best job. I don't care where they come from. Like that's, if I ran a business, my policy would be, I'm going to hire the people that are going to make me the most money.
Yeah, I think there's two huge things. Is one, I feel like people intuitively know this, but they turn their brain off for certain political things. So, like, a person will tell you, like, well, why are you opposed to mass migration? And they'll be like, well, if a bunch of people that look different than me and have slightly different cultures, show up in these areas, the culture is going to change, and that's scary. And then it's like, okay, well, then we look at like a workplace. Don't you think that having a more diverse workplace, just in and of itself, assuming all the qualifications are better, that would probably be a bit better because you'd have different people No.
Yeah.
Okay, so in some ways, it's like representation is the most important thing. But then when it's an area that you feel differently about for other political reasons, like, well, no, actually, I don't think it matters at all if every single person working here is white or male or whatever. I think people should just get over it. It's not a big deal. It's like, okay, well, why is it that like if too many brown people come in, the representation and the culture, everything is so important there, but then like in the workplace, if every single person looks the same, well, now all of a sudden it's totally a-okay. That drives me insane.
The politicization of immigration breaks my brain to the point where it makes me a little bit conspiratorial. Like, it makes absolutely no sense. Like, I guess when you think about it, it's like we have. So first of all, like the right, the people who are the most against immigration, or asylum, or any of these things, they're the pro-capitalist party, right? So like, capitalism needs one thing. That's economics 101. It needs growth. Like, without growth, capitalism dies. So why would you not want people of a lower social or lower economic class than you coming into your country to buy your shit and work for lower wages than what you're paying people now, and that money goes up to you? Like, if you're actually a greedy capitalist, that's a perfect scenario. And then on the side of rights and on the side of like, I feel like an immigrant is like almost like a libertarian, one of the libertarian superheroes that I can think of in my head. But it's somebody who's said, I don't like the place I live in. I don't like my government. I don't like the pressures that I have here. I don't like the work conditions. And they walk through the desert, hundreds of miles. They keep some of their family home. They trust all sorts of nefarious figures, and they walk through the desert and then come here where they don't even have any legal status. They say, fuck the law. I'm going to find a place to work, and I'm not going to pay any taxes. It's like a libertarian superhero. And for the entire right side of politics to be against that is just, it breaks my brain. I don't understand.
Well, that would be because conservatives aren't libertarian. That would be one of the reasons why. I would argue also that, remember, on the left side of the aisle, you get people like Bernie Sanders who are arguing against the H-1B visas too, because he says, well, it's just to bring cheap labor over here, and it's going to exploit American jobs, and it'll affect Americans.
Yeah.
It becomes very immigration tight when that stuff comes up. So I think it happens on the left or the right too. Nativism does. Now, when you talk about like, why are these capitalists not wanting to bring people in? And they say it'll affect the culture. Well, here's the truth. American culture is immigrant culture. Like, our entire thing, the entire thing that makes us different from France and UK and everywhere else in the world, right? All of Europe, where they say we're We're European centered. No, we're not the West. We are different. The American experiment is different than all of old Europe. It's different than everywhere else in the world because we import culture. That's what we do. We import culture, we Americanize it, and then we export our culture around the world. It's what allows us to be the market leader. It's what allows us to be the leader in pop culture and in art and in all of that expressive stuff that exports itself around the world. It is a good thing. And so, like, I'm a libertarian who will always champion immigration.
You like that, Enzo? I see you barking, boy. I got you 3 in a row. Oh, oh, oh. And we're getting! Yes, sir! I see you, Enzo! I see you!
With one dose, you can watch those dead fleas fall right off. Teach fleas a lesson with Capstar.
A lot of the oligarchs that run Silicon Valley have switched sides.
How serious do you take these weird niche political ideologies that crop up?
Well, unfortunately, I think we have to take them a lot more seriously because that Overton window really is shifting. People are abandoning liberalism, but the main problem is that I don't see any consistent alternative. Cancel culture, it exists. I've seen examples of it. You know, I have friends that have been affected by it, but that's not living under Stalin's, Soviet Union.
What do you envision that the Democrats could offer in 2028?
Ah, good. All right, I was waiting for that
I've
question.
been working up to it. Welcome to Doom Scroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Francis Fukuyama, a scholar and political scientist. He is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. He is a council member of the International Forum for Democratic Studies, founded by the National Endowment for Democracy, and he was a member of the Political Science Department of the RAND Corporation. He is the chair of the editorial board for American Purpose. Francis Fukuyama is the author of many books. He is most well known for his 1992 work, The End of History and The Last Man. Drawing on Hegel and Marx, he explores the concept of teleology, the idea that history is a linear process where human societies progress through sequential socioeconomic forms. As Marx famously wrote, feudalism was replaced by capitalism and would ultimately be replaced by socialism. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama argued that Western liberal democracy was the final form of human government. His thesis has been updated and revised many times since and remains a subject of debate up to today. He is considered by many to be the most influential political scientist of the late 20th century. You mentioned 2008 before. What is the chain of events that you see leading to the rise of Donald Trump?
Well, there's actually two things that moved me to the left and that I think moved Donald Trump further to the right. So the first was the Iraq War, and the second was the financial crisis, right, in 2003 and then in 2008. For me, the Iraq War demonstrated the bankruptcy of certain conservative ideas. So the Iraq War, all my former neocon friends, believed that you could use hard military power to reshape the politics of an entire region that was culturally very different, that we didn't really understand. And that turned out to be a big mistake. But then the financial crisis, demonstrated that this neoliberal model where you deregulate everything didn't work. Now, I strongly believe that there's a lot of parts of the American economy that do need to be deregulated, but the financial sector is not one of them. In fact, what the crisis demonstrated is if you don't regulate these guys up the wazoo, you're going to end up, in big trouble. My reaction to that is, yeah, you got to re-regulate certain parts of the economy, and you should stay out of stupid wars. I think that the consequence was a backlash because both of those things hurt ordinary people, right? Especially the financial crisis. So millions of Americans lost their homes because of the subprime, meltdown.
Yes.
And people were resentful because the Wall Street types that had really engineered that crash, they suffered a little bit for about a year, and then they're back to, their old billions of dollars in assets. And I think that's created long-term, shockwaves that we're still feeling to this day.
Huge contributions to the rise of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
There's a staggering statistic, I think this is from 2016, that The single greatest data point that is a predictor of whether a household went for Trump or for Clinton, that election, was if they had a family member or knew someone who died in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. We're in a strange situation now where Trump has won the popular vote. And previous to that, there was what many people have described, yourself included, as an insurrection at the Capitol. What does this mean for the current order, that we have both insurrection and then the popular victory?
It means that I think we're in for a much deeper disruption of our system than anyone thought. I mean, this is the transition that I've had trouble making, and a lot of people have had because you tend to think about, party politics in the United States. So liberals want this and conservatives want that, and, kind of one wants higher tax rates, the other one wants lower tax rates, and that's kind of the outer limits of the debate. And I think today those limits, that Overton window has really shifted in much more dramatic direction. So I think on the left there are things that are going to be on the table that weren't on the table before, but especially on the right, you're going to bring back a lot of ideas that, had been excluded under the old liberal order.
In 2025, can we say that there is a broad historical trend towards liberal democracy?
I think that the broad trend exhausted itself by about 2008. So this is what Samuel Huntington once labeled the third wave of democratization. It started with Spain and Portugal in the early 1970s. It kind of peaked with the collapse of communism. And then it's been downhill ever since about 2008. So there's been this big recession in democratization. It doesn't mean it's not going to start again. So the real question is this like a market correction where you've got this long-term trend towards democracy, or is it going to be replaced by something else, and are we kind of permanently, in this sort of recession or even depression? And that's an open question.
Moving to the left, you've described yourself as something of a social democrat nowadays.
If you have a capitalist or market economy, you're going to get inequalities. And if you don't regulate it carefully, first, you're going to get instability. So that's what we saw with the financial crisis. But secondly, you're going to get an increasingly skewed distribution of income and wealth. And therefore, you've got to do things to take the edges off of that. You can't eliminate those inequalities, but you can certainly mitigate them. The most sensible way to start is the way almost all countries started, Social Security and health care. We were very late in health care. Every other modern democracy had some form of universal guaranteed access to health care decades before the United States. Clinton tried it in the 90s, it failed. Obama didn't get to it until 2010 with the Affordable Care Act, and even then the Republicans spent the next decade trying to dismantle that. So it's been an uphill struggle, but I think that it's really important to have at least those two elements. Now, there are other forms of income redistribution. We actually do something that the Europeans don't do to equalize outcomes. We have a highly progressive income tax, whereas they raise most of their revenues through a value-added tax, which is actually more regressive because everybody pays a value-added tax, whereas only high-income earners, have these high marginal tax rates. So, we do things like that to equalize outcomes. And I just think if you look at the history of modern democracies, if you don't do something to redistribute income, you're going to end up with a huge populist backlash. And that's why I think some form of, social democracy is necessary to stabilize a capitalist economic system.
Do you have a preferred solution for the crisis of American healthcare?
No. I mean, that's such a tough problem because, in a way, we have the worst of all worlds. We have both socialized medicine and free market medicine, but we have them in all the wrong places, and so this fee-for-service model that most doctors operate under is crazy. They will prescribe every conceivable test, you get a runny nose, and they'll tell you, oh no, you have to have a CAT scan, an MRI, and this sort of thing. And it's just driven by this crazy system of incentives that we've implemented in this country. And so, yeah, I don't have a solution to this, but, I think there are sensible things that could be done to make this thing work better.
On this topic of inequality, there's a proposal from people like Peter Thiel to build freedom cities, quote unquote, special economic zones inside the U.S. Do you see this as a political possibility in the 21st century?
No, in fact, they tried to do this in Honduras or...
yes, it exists.
Yeah.
What is the name of it? Prospera.
Yeah. That just strikes me as a rich elite trying to ignore the problem by creating a kind of Disneyland for you and your family where, you can get away from all the problems that actually afflict, the rest of the society. And I just don't think that that's a very just, outcome. I mean, in a way, we've done that already, with suburbanization and, suburbs wanting to pull away from their inner city cores, this sort of thing. And I just don't think that that's a fair, way of solving these social problems.
With Asana, AI teammates can pull real-time data and help keep work on track, so every team can work smarter and faster. Asana, the #1 AI work management platform. Try for free today at asana.com.
Background your research into the process of state formation. How seriously do you take any of these libertarian exit projects, building these private city-states, network states, so to speak?
Well, I don't think that they quite understand, the imperatives that stand behind states and particularly behind effective states, because, really what makes a state good is a lot of capacity and a lot of authority behind that capacity, and then the constraints that operate to make sure that that power is not misused. And I just think that most libertarians don't think in those terms. They want the freedom part, but they don't want the state capacity part. They don't want governments that are actually capable of doing things that, benefit the broader society. And that's why I think, most of these projects are really not going to work.
It strikes me that the complete irrationality of Doge is, this is like what we would do to a country that we colonized.
Yeah.
Implementing Chicago
or didn't
school
like very
austerity.
much. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is wild. So we won't have Shenzhen at home.
Well, you think about it. What organization, if you simply went and fired a random 20% of their employees, would function well after that? Without any thought to which 20% you're getting rid of. It's a crazy, it makes you think the real intention is actually not efficiency, it's just destruction.
A few years ago, you were famously quoted as saying that socialism should come back. In what ways should socialism come back?
Well, in exactly the way that I mentioned. I think that you need more state intervention to equalize outcomes. And, that means things like actually having a real effective, affordable, universal healthcare system. It means shoring up your pension system so it's not going to go bankrupt. Properly speaking, that's social democracy and not socialism, because
Right.
I think socialism implies ownership of all the productive assets, and I don't think that's a good solution. But I do think judicious regulation and provision of certain basic services like healthcare is really necessary.
So we're not talking about capital S socialism
No.
coming back in the 21st century. How much of today's political chaos is a result of social media, and how much of it is an underlying real political crisis?
Yeah, that's a really hard one to pin down, because I think both of them are obviously factors. But as time has gone on, I tend to think that actually the technology contribution is more important than I was inclined to think at first. And part of the reason is that, if you listen to the rhetoric coming from, it comes from the left, but especially now from the right, you think that we're living in this absolute hellscape, where there's censorship and tyranny and, people being, forcibly ejected from, certain spheres of, social life. And that just doesn't correspond to anything I've experienced. So for example, cancel culture, it exists. I've seen examples of it. I have friends that have been affected by it, but that's not living under Stalin's, Soviet Union. There's really a difference there. And so the extremeness with which people think that we're in the midst of a social crisis is something that I find hard to explain apart from social media, because what the internet does is it allows you to live in your own bespoke world where, you only see the facts that you want to see, and everything, confirms the biases that you started with. And I think that, that's one of the things that the internet has brought us.
And if it is creating more political instability, what kind of constraints would you be willing to accept on social media?
I chaired a Stanford working group on platform scale back in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And we were trying to address this problem of who is it that should control social media. And it was a big dilemma, because you don't want these big private platforms to be the arbiters of what's true, and what's acceptable speech. But you also don't want the government to do that. The government tried to get into that after 2016, and that's what created this big, revolt on the right, where they claimed that the government was trying to censor them and so forth. And the only solution that we could come up with was something we called middleware, where you would basically take away the mediation function from these big platforms and give it to third parties that would hopefully create a competitive ecosystem of basically, media filters. And you could pick anyone you wanted. So instead of X or Facebook making the decisions through their algorithms as to what you saw, you could pick, what it was you want. I think that was the original vision of the internet, not that everybody would see the same thing regulated by the government, but you'd have a choice in the kind of stuff that you saw online. We put that idea out there, some people have tried to pick up on it, but there's no business model that we could come up with that supports it. But as far as I can see, that's kind of the only way that you can deal with this problem, that you can simply pick and choose your own ways of filtering the internet. So if you don't want to see a certain, type of material, you can choose not to.
So just to restate this to make sure I understand, so platforms like Twitter or Instagram, things like this exist. We're all users within those different networks, those different stacks. I'm posting, you're posting, but the thing that filters and prioritizes my newsfeed is designed by a third party rather than Meta or X or so on.
And the thing is that when the platform is writing the algorithm, they've got a financial incentive, for virality. They don't care whether it's true. They don't care whether it's good for democracy. They basically want to get as much user engagement as possible, and that's one of the things that's fed the current, crisis. And so if you take that power away from them and give it to the users themselves, our view was that would at least, it wouldn't get rid of the problem of compartmentalization, and filter bubbles, but it would take this big power away from the platforms, to determine what it was that their users saw.
Yeah, so this think tank in 2020, I've heard people propose similar things before. I think what may happen in the near future, the platforms are already working on these type of filters that basically you're going to have a dial that goes between left and right and between outrageous and boring. And you're going to prioritize it for your own, whatever preferences. But there's no third-party accountability in that model, and that's what they would prefer.
I mean, having at least that degree of choice would be an improvement over what happens now, where you've got these completely untransparent algorithms. So, whatever degree of control you can insert would be a good thing, but I don't think you can trust the platforms ultimately to be the ones that provide those controls, because they're still going to be looking to their bottom lines and what's, most profitable for them. And that's why giving it to a third party, I think, is still a much preferable route to take.
How important are memes in shaping political discourse?
I should be asking you that. Yeah, I mean, I think...
you wrote a great piece recently about the material basis of changing gender relations, about these Elon Musk and Trump are in the sweatshop factories putting together, they're stitching clothes or something.
Yeah, no, I think that that's the way people communicate these days. It's, through these little snippets of ideas rather than whole coherent ideas. And I think it's, it's pretty important. There's also, I think, a huge generational difference because people in my generation don't think that way.
You are, though, very literate in these things, comparatively speaking. For, most people I talk to, you're more aware of them. I wonder also if there's some level of your work and the breadth of the Overton window in what you write about and research that fits with social media so that you have some level of awareness before these memes even crop up. Like there was a candidate a few years ago that ran for the Transhumanist Party. This is something you've written about a lot. And if you don't know the kind of background of that philosophy, you might assume it's like a novelty of social media, but there actually is, many years of people working towards these goals, particularly from the libertarian camp.
Yeah.
How serious do you take these weird niche political ideologies that crop up?
Well, unfortunately, I think we have to take them a lot more seriously because that Overton window really is shifting, quite rapidly.
Yeah.
And stuff that seemed really unacceptable previously, like just overt racism, is now creeping back into the discourse. And so, if you don't pay attention to it, it's going to hit you over the head. Like
maybe Doge is the preeminent example of this. It literally was a meme and is now policy. There's been a drift on the libertarian on the right in the last few years, people moving from this techno-libertarianism to a kind of national conservatism that's very infused with this new right mimetic language. Do you think these people are for real, or are they a kind of hallucination of social media dynamics?
Well, so there's several parts to that, or several parts to an answer. So it is really the case that a lot of the oligarchs that run Silicon Valley have switched sides.
Yeah.
Right? They used to be social liberals, and now they've signed up with Trump and MAGA and so forth. And there's only a handful of them, but they're really important because they got a lot of money and they've got a lot of influence. They got a lot of followers. All the Thiels and Andreessens and Musks and so forth. So that part of it is right. I guess the part that I'm less aware of is what so these are the generals and the commanders. I'm not sure the army beneath them, how much of that is following them or not. And I think that's, really going to determine their ultimate, effectiveness. And the thing is that they've kind of gotten into bed with people that they don't really agree with on a lot of things. It turns out that...
Who are you thinking of?
Well, I mean, this fight that emerged between Musk and Ramaswamy and also Steve Bannon, they are really international. I mean, the oligarchs are internationalists in terms of talent and, who to hire and this sort of thing. And the real Trump base is not.
You mentioned Lina Khan before. Do you take Steve Bannon at his word for this anti-monopoly stuff?
Well, it's not Steve Bannon, it's J.D. Vance. He actually is very much in favor of that whole antitrust line, and he's, I was about to say more thoughtful than Bannon. I'm not sure that that's actually true, but it's very interesting. So essentially, everybody that worked in the Biden administration has become enemy number one to the Trump people, except for Lina Khan.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And that's another point of tension between the tech oligarchs and this administration, because I know a lot of them really soured on the Democratic Party and on Joe Biden because of Lina Khan.
Yeah.
They really didn't like her moving against their companies and preventing them from, buying startups and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But Trump is doing the same thing.
Did Trump end neoliberalism?
No, neoliberalism ended long before Trump.
When did it end?
Well, it ended in the financial crisis, really.
2008.
I think that it was these neoliberal free market principles that led to the financial crisis. And everybody at that point began to realize, if the state doesn't step in and regulate, you're going to have more of these crises. And so the move away from neoliberalism, I think, really began there. that's the point also, that people were really aware of the increasing inequality in the United States in terms of income and wealth, and that was also going to become politically destabilizing. And then, you had a big academic literature about the effect of, China's entry into the WTO and the way that globalization, this is one of these kind of, in retrospect, very annoying things because, when I taught at SAIS at Johns Hopkins, we indoctrinated everybody into free trade, liberal economics, that was the way to go. And at that time, all of the economists said, well, okay, so not everybody is better off under a free trade system. Some workers lose out, their jobs go to Mexico or China.
Manufacturing.
Yeah, manufacturing, but we can always compensate them. We can retrain them. And that's the part that never happened.
Right.
And that's why I think people are legitimately angry about, the results of free trade. And I think, I don't know of very many economists that won't admit now that was a really big problem.
Right.
That they had been advocates for a kind of ruthless kind of free trade that made a lot of empty promises to the workers that were going to be hurt by it, and the society never.
Ready for sizzling summer savings at Grocery Outlet? This week only, get assorted varieties of Adele's all-natural chicken sausage 12-ounce packs for just $3.99 each. And what's summer without cheeseburgers on the grill or delicious sandwiches with the family? Pick up Kraft American Cheese Singles 12-ounce packs for just $2.29 each. Save up to 50% off both compared to traditional grocery stores. This deal ends July 1st while supplies last, so head on into your local Grocery Outlet today.
Grocery Outlet Bargain Market.
Followed through on those promises. And so I think that process started really a lot earlier than Donald Trump.
So I find that very interesting because the theoretical proofs, the scholarship at the time, said that if we move manufacturing elsewhere, maybe American wages go down, but the goods get so cheap that everyone's living standards go up.
Yeah.
Right? And that was, you run all these theorems, that was the macroeconomic consensus. Was that ever true? Was that a lie? Was that a piece of propaganda?
Well, no, it was obviously true because you had Walmart where you could buy stuff really cheaply, and any worker could do that. But, the question, it's more of a value question, I would say, that if the consequence of having all these cheap consumer goods available is that a very significant part of the middle class basically falls into poverty or into opioid, addiction and, all of the social ills that go with this kind of downward social mobility, is that a price that is worth it? Right. And I think a lot of people have decided in retrospect it wasn't, that there's a certain dignity to work, even if it's not the most efficient, even if you could do the same work in another country for a lot less. People still want to have pride in what they do in their communities, and therefore it's legitimate for the government to protect this. And by the way, in different countries, they didn't go in for this kind of neoliberalism to the same extent. So one thing that's very noticeable, if you go to either Japan or France, which are the two countries I think about in this regard, there's a lot of little restaurants, mom and pop shops. There's still a lot of kind of small business retailers. The downtowns haven't emptied out into these big box stores. And this is all deliberate, it was protectionism, because I think that in those societies, people realize that we have a certain way of life and we don't want to disrupt that way of life, even if the Americans have this efficient system where everybody, just goes to Amazon or goes to, Walmart or something. And so I do think that there are alternative ways of dealing with the social side that reflected, a different set of values that was conservative in the sense that we don't want to disrupt and undermine, our existing society more radically than we have to.
To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon. Is DEI crashing the planes?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that the overt forms of DEI that existed are simply not going to, first of all, they're being criminalized right now. So people aren't going to do it. The more interesting question, I think, is how much of that anti-DEI ideology is actually going to be absorbed by people on the left, or at least in the kind of center left, and become, again, part of the mainstream, because that's the part that's not clear to me. I personally have no problem in theory with affirmative action, because it does seem to me that, people are not just these individuals that are born, out of nothing. I mean, they do reflect the kind of societies they come from, and not everybody is equally advantaged. So I don't think it's terrible for the state to take some role in trying to equalize those outcomes. But I do think that it was taken too far in a lot of circumstances. And, especially after George Floyd in 2020, you had extreme forms of it, in terms of defund the police and, Robin DiAngelo and, white fragility. I mean, all these interpretations of DEI that I think were just kind of, at the time I thought they were kind of ridiculous. And that part of it is clearly going to go away. What is both troubling and, a more interesting question is how much of it, after the immediate Trump effect is worn off. Let's say you get a Democratic president in 2028 who doesn't enforce this really harsh anti-DEI stuff. How much of it is actually going to remain as a kind of cultural norm? That you don't go out of your way to hire an African American or a woman or, someone who's, gay or lesbian, for the, to run your company. That simply just doesn't become the first thought, because I think with a lot of organizations, after 2020, that was the way that they thought.
What kind of effect did those slogans, defund the police, have on the Democratic Party base?
It was terrible. I honestly cannot think of a stupider slogan than defund the police. It's stupid both substantively, because you need the police. You want to reform the police. You don't want to get rid of them. So as a substantive policy matter, it was a really dumb thing. But politically, it was just incredibly harmful, because, and actually, there's a study that was recently published that turns out the people that were the most in favor of that kind of policy were actually white liberals. That, African Americans, Hispanics, people that lived in these poor communities, that was not something that they liked very much, because they actually needed the police to keep order in their communities, right? And so I think this was, it's something that became trendy among a certain kind of progressive, and it really did a lot to stimulate the opposite, so the anti-DEI movement, in large measure, we have these DEI excesses to thank for.
It's a long time ago now, but as I recall the statistics, the district in which Eric Garner was killed was among the largest shift towards the Republicans around 2020.
Yeah.
How seriously should we take this post-liberalism that comes from the right?
Well, I think it's pretty serious, because it answers to a real longing that people have that liberalism is not satisfying. So, liberalism begins with a premise: you're living in a diverse society, you've got to tolerate people, you're not going to agree on a lot of things. And so there's no strong form of community in liberalism. And I think that that's really what people are objecting to, because, human beings are social creatures by nature. They want to bond with other people. And in liberal society, you just get along. You don't really have any sharp moral disagreements. You want to tolerate everybody. You don't want to be judgmental. And I think people actually do want to be judgmental, and they want to have, high standards. They don't agree on those standards, but, I think that that's what they're objecting to. And therefore, they want to posit a society, with strong gods, with powerful moral imperatives.
Yes.
And those can be either on the right or on the left.
There's a few different factions in this post-liberal element of the new right that's come about. We have Catholics, anarcho-capitalists, monarchists. Which of these groups do you think is the most influential?
Well, I don't know that there's any one. I mean, the Catholic integralists, I think, are hopeless because they're presuming that somehow we're all going to agree on some conservative version of Catholicism, which is kind of ridiculous. You know, I think the people like Curtis Yarvin that claim to be monarchists are just kidding themselves. I mean, I think it's something said to be outrageous because it's so contrary to everything in the American tradition that, you know, who's really going to follow that? I think that, you know, the more serious people are people that really want to reimpose some kind of moral hierarchy and don't really accept, you know, the liberal view that everybody's equal. But again, there's no agreement on, you know, what that new class structure looks like.
I've heard you describe American conservatives as Lockean liberals. What changed in American conservatism?
Well, this was a traditional way of understanding, you know, Ronald Reagan type conservatives. So John Locke is kind of the founding father of Anglo-Saxon conservatism. Everybody's out there as an individual in the state of nature, and then they come together, they sign a social contract that allows them to live peacefully, you know, under certain rules with one another. But there's no strong prior community, there's no kind of overarching set of values except for, you know, liberal values. And I think that, you know, what we associate with the Reagan years, you know, flows from that. Very strong property rights, very strong individualism, you know, kind of defense of, you know, your own sphere of autonomy, that sort of thing. So I think that's, and the property part is really important. I mean, that's really what distinguishes Locke, because he says anything you mix your labor with is your property.
Right.
And I think that that's actually, that was a big insight because that, you know, creation of private property is what makes for modern economics, and that's why liberal societies got rich very early on. So that economic dimension, I think, is important to Lockean liberalism.
For Locke, if I recall correctly, he's talking about mixing your labor with the land, particularly in
well, he says the
hereditary
useless things
passive.
of nature. He's not
The
a,
useless things of
he's not an
nature.
environmentalist. You know.
Yeah.
He says that, you know, all these, you know, things out there, these plants and animals, actually don't have any value until human beings actually do something with them.
Sure. There's something about the conservation, the stewardship of cultivating crops, though, that proper conservation of the land.
Yeah, well, that's what it means to mix your labor with it, because, you know, the field would be fallow unless you plow it and seed it and, you know, so forth, right? So, and that's what produces wealth.
Is the United States headed back to early 1900s oligarchy?
It could be something worse than early 19th century. Well, I mean, because there's so much more money in the world. You know, I mean, the difference between a kind of minimum wage worker and one of these tech billionaires is much larger than the difference between, you know, J.P. Morgan and a you know, kind of guy off the boat, you know, in the late 19th century. And so the sheer amount of money that's available to go, and the fact that we allow as much money as anyone wants to be spent in politics is something that gives people a degree of political power that I think, you know, the J.P. Morgans of the 19th century didn't really exercise. Plus which, you know, the norms are really shot now, and so the willingness of people to use their money for, you know, for private purposes is, I think, much greater.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that view myself, but then there's some striking numbers in the last election that I think Kamala Harris outspent Trump, Nikki Haley outspent Trump 2-1, and so post Citizens United, the vote is still very powerful, more powerful than we had thought.
No, that's true. So I think that, yeah, you can overestimate how important money is, but it's still important, you know.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, it creates a baseline, and it's actually a deterrent to a lot of people running that simply couldn't play in that league.
How would you propose to combat American oligarchs?
So there's a number of ways of doing it. We gave up on antitrust because of the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s and 80s. People like Robert Bork and George Stigler made this, you know, it was an academic argument, and they had some powerful reasons for thinking that the reason that companies got really big is that they're more efficient, and therefore we should leave them alone. The trouble is that, you know, under digital technologies that have emerged, The scale is much larger. It's much easier to reach, 1 billion people than it was, when you're making widgets, or physical things. I mean, and so I think that the problem of oligarchy, simply changed. But you can still do things about that. I mean, there's actually this suit, antitrust suit that was started under Biden and is continuing under Trump, to break up Google. So that's one thing. You can actually force Google to divest, one of the things that Lena Khan was going after was this tendency of these big platforms to buy startups that would threaten their position.
Yes.
Is it Meta buying Instagram?
WhatsApp,
yeah,
so on. Yeah.
Hard to keep these things. Yeah, so that was one way that they were maintaining their position, is simply preempting competition by buying them out, so you can restrict that. You can force divestments, because a lot of the companies that these big platforms own are mutually interdependent, and they get this incredible market data, because they own, these big databases, and they can hit any market they want, because they know so much about the consumers that their rivals don't have. And so there are ways that you can interfere in that ecosystem. You can simply tax people. This is Bernie Sanders' approach. The trouble is that that doesn't actually yield enough revenue, not nearly as much as he thinks it would. But, you can still tax the people that got the money.
Where did woke liberalism come from?
Well, it's got a long history that people may not remember. My mentor was Alan Bloom, who in 1988 published a book called The Closing of the American Mind. And in that book, he talks about actually what was DEI back in those days. It didn't go under that particular label, but identity politics really made its first moves in that period, where people started to say, well, you don't want to teach Plato and Aristotle because they're just, white men that, don't speak to people of color, don't speak to women, this sort of thing. And so that kind of identity politics, I think, really, it was an evolution, it was a gradual evolution. You might say that it began with the 68 uprisings in Paris, where old-fashioned class politics started to be replaced by identity politics, and the most prominent forms of inequality were not between worker and bourgeoisie, but now between men and women, between, heteronormative people and, gays and lesbians, this sort of thing. And that was something that really evolved really in the last couple of decades of the 20th century, and then got a really, fresh start at the beginning of the 21st.
Is there, I've heard you talk about this before, but there's even, I think, deeper origin for this, Rousseau's discourse on inequalities?
Well, you could actually go back to Martin Luther. In a certain sense, identity politics is based on this belief that there's a sharp distinction between your inner self and the outer social self that is visible to other people. And the single philosopher that talked about this the most extensively was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because he said that natural man, the inner self, was really good, was not violent, was not envious, was not competitive, but it was the invention of society and the moment that people started comparing themselves to other people that all the evils of the world started. And before Rousseau, basically every society said, no, the inner self is bad. The inner self is violent, selfish, and we have to impose social control on that inner self so it doesn't become destructive. With Rousseau, you flip the valence, and all of a sudden it's the inner self that's good and authentic, and it's the surrounding society that's hypocritical, that makes people do stuff that they don't believe in, and so forth. And you see this evolving in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, so that you get, basically the basis for modern identity. That, and this probably comes out in sexual politics the most clearly, where you have people that are gay or lesbian. They feel that on the inside, that that's their real self, but the society is forcing them to get married, to have, pretend that they're heterosexual, and so forth. And the coming out becomes a moment of the liberation of the authentic self. So in that case, it's something real. I mean, there is an inner self that's being suppressed by society. But I think at that point, it becomes a general model where authenticity is prized for its own sake. And it also is based on a kind of Rousseauian assumption that authentic inner self is good, and you want people to express that inner self. And that, becomes the basis for identity politics, because identity politics, tells you things like, well, I may be a Canadian citizen, but I'm really a French-speaking Quebecois, underneath, or I'm Catalan, I'm not really Spanish, that I have this inner identity that is being suppressed by politics, by society, and I want to be able to express that freely.
Well, that sounds potentially dangerous, because to reify that identity means there's an exit movement in Quebec, Quebec nationalists, which are, if not adjacent to or just directly neo-Nazis, white supremacist movement.
Yeah, that's the whole difference between Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes thought that inner self was pretty bad and violent, and Rousseau thought it was good and gentle. And, I think in general, Hobbes had the better of that argument. So releasing the inner self of everybody was not necessarily a formula for getting to a better world.
You mentioned the 68 generation, though. What influence has the 68 generation had on the American left?
It didn't have a direct effect because the United States was going through something very similar, right? You had the New Left that appeared at the time of the Vietnam War, and you had these big social movements that were triggered by big events. So the war was one thing, the rise of feminism, the rise of environmental consciousness, all of these things happened more or less simultaneously sometime during the 1960s. And that began to transform the nature of progressive ideology and thought from what it had been through most of the 20th century, where, social class defined in Marxist terms was really the way that people thought about inequality, to these newer issues. And so the American left was undergoing that same transformation, right? That people that had been wanting to be union organizers, and stick it to the man, all of a sudden became environmentalists, So that was a kind of parallel thing that was going on in Europe when they made the transition out of this hardcore, Marxism into more modern forms of progressive thought.
If that transition had not happened, might we be in a different situation today with some of these?
You probably know Vistaprint for business cards, but did you know we print everything you need to brand your business? We print banners and signs that help you stand out, and must-have merch like tote bags, t-shirts, and hoodies. Right now, new customers can get 20% off with code NEW20, because if you need it, we print it at Vistaprint.com.
Social democratic programs intact?
Well, it's interesting because Bernie Sanders is the one progressive politician that hasn't completely forgot about that older understanding of the left. He still likes just overt economic redistribution. He still thinks in class terms. He had to be kind of forced to think in terms of gender, sexual orientation. These issues did not come naturally to him. And so, there's still a part of the left. And in other parts of the world, it's much stronger. So in Latin America, for example, you have a much more classic left wing that still thinks in kind of Marxist class terms. They're beginning to make the transition to this more American style identity politics, but it hasn't, proceeded nearly as far.
What do you envision that the Democrats could offer in 2028 to defeat this Trumpism?
Good. All right, I was waiting for that
I've
question.
been working up to it.
Like I'm really all on board the abundance movement. Ezra Klein's.
I had a feeling. Okay.
Yeah.
I've
been really interested in infrastructure for some years now, and it's been one of my kind of big research topics because it's really striking that we don't build stuff anymore. High-speed rail, the failure to roll out rural internet, high-speed internet. There's just a whole bunch of things that, don't happen that really ought to be happening. And I think that Ezra is right in the sense that this is actually the fault of progressives, because what progressives have done is to believe that legitimacy lies in procedures, and therefore to legitimize something, you need to add more layers of procedures to the point where it gets really hard to actually do things like build transmission lines. So right now, the major producers of alternative energy in the United States are Texas and Oklahoma, these two deep red states. And the demand for that is in California, and you can't build transmission lines to get that electricity from the middle of the country to where it's needed because the permitting constraints are too great. It takes almost 10 years to get a permit for a transmission line in the United States. And so I think that if you actually want to combat Trumpism, you have to have a positive vision of what the country could look like. And the Democrats just haven't done that. You know, they're critiquing Trump. They hate, and I do too, the authoritarian instincts that he's got and the authoritarian direction that he's taking the country. But you got to be able to say what your vision, is going to look like if you come to power. And I think there's a failure on the progressive side to appreciate that a lot of the support for Trump was driven by dislike for them. It wasn't just identity politics, but also the fact that blue cities, you can't do stuff. They make it too difficult. So I think that this is why just a vision where you could actually move to a low carbon future, provide a lot of jobs, and do it quickly is a very appealing, kind of vision. And I think it's something that, progressives need to embrace.
Yeah, there's something interesting that's happened where the Democrats have become so wrapped up in procedure that it emboldens the other side to say that, well, maybe we should have a CEO dictator.
Yeah,
Just
maybe
cut
we
through
should
the red
get rid of
tape.
all procedure. Yeah.
How did you feel about Joe Biden's spending on infrastructure?
Well, it revealed exactly what the problem is, that, he got the money appropriated through Congress, but he didn't fix the broken parts, which really were the implementation side. Obama kind of recognized that because he had an infrastructure bill, and he made this statement, there's no such thing as a shovel-ready project because there are too many regulatory requirements that have to be overcome, and the bureaucracy is too hidebound to actually implement, what Congress has mandated. So, the classic example of this is $40 billion were appropriated in one of Biden's bills for rural high-speed internet, and not a single household had been connected by the time he left office, right, for all of these reasons. And, he was hoping that building things under his infrastructure plan would get him a lot of votes, but almost none of those projects ever materialized. Actually, Trump is the one that's going to benefit because by the time they get through all the permitting requirements, Trump is in office and, he's going to claim credit for them.
We did it again, boys.
Yeah.
What do you think the critics of this say, that the $40 billion, it's still sitting there, it hasn't been tapped, so it's not like the money disappeared, but just it's waiting to be greenlit?
But what do you appropriate money for? This really gets down to this really basic problem, I think, in modern liberalism. Do you actually want government for concrete things that government does, or does it just exist as a matter of procedures and we celebrate the procedures? I think most ordinary people want actual results. And so who cares whether the money is there if you don't have the high-speed internet in your home, right? And I think that that's really something that people on the left have to take much more seriously, is that you need to get to these demonstrable results that make people's lives better if you want them to vote for you. And I think there's a clear path to doing it. I think it's not just consistent with liberal or progressive principles. It's actually, it should be part of progressivism. The progressive movement in the late 19th century, the New Deal, all used government to do things. Electrify the Tennessee Valley, build the Golden Gate Bridge, build Hoover Dam, and we've kind of lost that ability to use the government to do positive things like that.
In your book, The Origins of Political Order, you focus on China as the exemplary path to modernization. Why should we focus on this example of China as opposed to Europe?
In my view, a modern government consists of three different pillars. So the first is a state. a modern, effective, impersonal state. And what I was arguing in that book was the first civilization to create such a state was China, and they did this in about the 5th century BC, so 1800 years before the Europeans ever got there. But that's not enough. You know, the state is just power, but if you have a state without constraint, you have a dictatorship. And so really to have a modern, I think, balanced political system, you need other institutions. So the first is a rule of law. So rule of law restricts the power of the state, so the ruler can't just do whatever the ruler wants. And then you need democracy, democratic accountability, right? So you've got a power institution, which is the state, and then 2 institutions of constraint, rule of law and democracy. And hopefully you'll get some kind of balance right, because if you're too far over on the state side, you've got a dictatorship, and if you're too far over on the constraint side, you've got a kind of incoherent, political system that can't actually do stuff. And I think what I argued in that book was that the Chinese got the first of these. They got the state part, so they've got a really high-quality, competent state that can do all sorts of stuff, right? They decide they're going to manufacture semiconductors and robots and all that stuff, and they just do it. What they don't have is a constraint on that state. They obviously don't have democracy. They looked like they were sort of inching towards rule of law in the 1990s, but Xi Jinping just said, no, forget about it. It's all the power of the Communist Party. So they got 1/3 of the formula right, but the other 2/3, they're just, they're not at the cutting edge.
I feel like we're batting 1 for 3 ourselves right now.
Yeah, we are. Living here in California, I think we're actually at the other extreme. Like we got too many constraints, and we've got a very weak state. And so this is my spectrum. It goes from China on the one side to the state of California on the other.
Francis Fukuyama, it's been fantastic talking to you. I have immense admiration for your work.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. To watch part 2 of this episode, you can support the show on Patreon.
Welcome to a moment of calmness from One A Day. That's right, a calming moment from a vitamin brand. Wait, don't zone out yet. One A Day multivitamins help provide nutritional support for your well-being as part of a healthy lifestyle. Whether you're navigating a busy day or seeking quiet reflection, One A Day vitamins are here for you. Choose clarity, choose wellness, choose One A Day multivitamins. Science that matters for nutritional support. Grab your One A Day vitamins at your favorite retailer today.
You and I participated in political movements and leftist spaces. Don't you feel like sometimes you're in a room with like a lot of really fragile eggs who can't deal with actual confrontation or contradiction because if they bump up against each other, they think they're going to crack? We need to discuss why left politics has no popular appeal, why it gets absorbed by liberalism, why we're in the situation today, this new communitarianism that was sort of the structure of the internet at the bottom of the California ideology is all about this instantaneous transformation. The thing now that people are rejecting, I think, is that in actuality, democratic forms and capitalism cannot coexist, and capitalism is eating democracy alive.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My returning guest is Catherine Liu, a professor of film and media studies at UC Irvine. She is the author of Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class. To what do you attribute this emphasis on morality, specifically the word care, among white-collar professionals in the last few years?
So, D.W. Winnicott says that when mothers give birth to children and human adults take care of that child, they move into a special state of being where they're vigilant and they have to care for this infant to the detriment often of themselves.
Right.
There's like this unthinking sacrifice and gift giving. We all receive that kind of care, or else we would not be alive. I mean, we're born like little mole children, really. We can't move our head. We have no spinal control. Our heads go back this way if they're not supported, which is psychically and physically damaging. And so the holding of an infant is about this kind of intense, vigilant attentiveness that Winnicott says we move out of as the infant becomes more independent. But this intense state of care, I think, is the proper idea of using that term. We translate it, dilute it in the liberal world into caring about animals, caring about earth, caring about art, caring about social justice. But that kind of care is so reduced and so reified in liberal discourse today. And there's something liberating about the right and the Republicans when they're like, we don't care. We don't care about recycling. we don't care about fossil fuels. We care about everyone being able to drive around freely. There's a kind of immersive pleasure in the world that rejects this reduced form of vigilance, this very reduced, superficial form of vigilance, very performative kind of moralizing thing that happens within the liberal discourse today. And I've been talking a lot about virtue, right? And it's not real virtue, though, that the white-collar elites hoard. It's this very reduced, reified form of virtue. Like, something about Christianity that is really amazing, though, when you, I think I've like OD'd on the imagery, but no, if you go through the churches of Europe, you'll see this Madonna and Child is such an important duo in Christianity, and part of it is about this realization, physicalization of the care thing, right? And I think that we want to think that the deity and some all-powerful being cares about us. And it's terrifying to think about that indifference. So we become, in our everyday lives, little gods. Now, the thing that caring all the time about things, this liberal ideal, but I think the thing about the right, and I just watched Trump's performance, he plays the child, and the liberals play the caring, powerful, but kind of punitive mother figure. And his childishness is like, let's just enjoy. I'm going to be the circus barker. Let's just have performativity. And there's this kind of transgressive attitude that he has that's very much directed at, this owning the libs. Because the liberal hegemony is like this horrible mother figure who's been oppressing us with her, like, you don't care about your grades? That's, just all of these things about not arriving at care and being sanctioned for it is a kind of punitive maternal superego thing. So on the one hand, you have the superficial caring, and then on the other hand, you have this owning that's taking place about caring. I think we're trapped in the Thunderdome right now. There's no exit.
You mentioned this latent theme of infantilization. Is there some type of analogy we could draw here between the erosion of lowercase d democracy, this kind of punitive parental figure, and treating individual subjects or participants in democratic society as infants?
There's this essay by Kant called What is Enlightenment? And people don't read it anymore because he talks about how important it is for people to reach maturity, to become citizens of a democracy. And, you can see, like, all of these hyper-liberal academics who want to decolonize everything just, like, freaking out about this essay. Like, what? That's so normative? Like, who wants to be mature? Maturity is really, like, oppressive, and you have to, he's gatekeeping reason. Like, I just, when I read it, I'm just like, I just hear everyone objecting to it now. I'm like, no one's reading it. I love this essay because I value reason. I value rationality. But you can see all these, like, we need to decolonize adulthood. We need to decolonize reason. We need to be like, what about feelings and vibes and all this? But this started like in the 80s and 90s when I was in graduate school already. Like, people were like, that's so heteropatriarchal normative. That because Foucault actually, my shibboleth actually wrote a counter essay against Kant. And so you have this idea that maturity is normative, maturity gives you this straight path. People, if you're immature, you can't participate. And so what we've had in this liberal reaction against the Enlightenment is this sacralization of immaturity and polymorphous perversity, which means that you are just a surface of feelings. Like everyone loved to live for a while, where you're just a surface of feelings and vibes. And if you're like vibing wrong with something, you're having like a non-dialectical relationship with the other, whatever they say. But there's no differentiation. Sorry, I can't stop making fun of them. But there's no differentiation. You're like an egg. And I really feel like a lot of these young people today and living online, you're literally the egg avatar. Like, your skin is very fragile.
They literally make memes of this. They call it the body without organs, and it's a character of an egg. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the delusion thing. But then we have like we have Tumblr and older forms of social media, Instagram now, TikTok, everything else, taking that body without organs and forgetting about it, but using its principles to say that it's better to be this undifferentiated egg-like organism that's just feeling or vibrating with the world. And part of the thing about Freud that I think is really important that nobody wants, everyone thinks is very normative, is human beings are born in a very egg-like way. We're not differentiated. And we psychologically have to learn about our genitals. We have to learn about control of our bodies, literally controlling our spine, but also control of the sphincter, control of all the orifices, in fact. And all the orifices give us so much pleasure. In the beginning, you cry, you get the boob, you poop, it's kind of fun. And then you learn, like, you can't poop here, every time you cry, you're not getting the boob anymore. You have to accede to the world in a different way. Children learn through orality, but I feel like the egg and the egg avatar is all about like non-differentiation and celebrating like genital immaturity. Genital maturity also makes us have to confront our mortality. It makes us confront our limits and our bodily limits. When you and I have participated in political movements and leftist spaces, don't you feel like sometimes you're in a room with like a lot of really fragile eggs who can't deal with actual confrontation or contradiction because if they bump up against each other, they think they're going to crack. And that's just not a way to relate to the world. The difficulty of the world right now, the challenges that we're facing, the trust that we need to have with regard to communication can't be adjudicated by a bunch of eggs in a room worried about cracking each other. Oh, wow. And you know what? Compared with these eggs, Donald Trump as like angry, happy baby seems to be a relief.
I've heard you use the phrase before, the tyranny of affect. What is the tyranny of affect?
Affect and affect theory has to do with a kind of rationalization of feeling. And the whole question of affect is that it's not, they like to say, the affect theory people, that it's not individual, it's in the room, it's collective, it is infectious, but this, non-individualized, non-communicative, non-irrational feeling is something that seems to justify a certain kind of behavior, justify a certain kind of attitude towards the other, towards objectivity. And so it's to say that we share an affect, but we don't share an objective world that we can describe, which is like the principle of physics, right? But you and I have this feeling, and we're in the vibes world. I do think vibes are important because I think like when you look at the austerity of certain kinds of hyper-rational people in my profession, it's really frightening how disconnected they are from affect.
Good morning.
But affect is important, but it's not the end-all and be-all of intersubjectivity. It's good to know where I end and you begin. But I feel like in the affect vibe world, it's just like, let's just vibe together. Have you ever seen like Gen Zers talk? They're like this. They just nod. We're doing it right now. I'm making you do it. And there's this like assumed consent or assent to things that actually has no space for skepticism, for mutual recognition, maybe for my rejection of your ideas, but our shared reality says we have to confront certain struggles in the world. We have to confront physics, gravity. We share a physical world. We share an economic world of growing inequality. We share a world where corruption is the name of the game. But we can't name any of these things if we're only vibing. And if I don't have any boundaries with regard to my assent, and I'm afraid to contradict you or dissent from you, because then we will be cut off. Our egg-like connection will be broken. Then we can't actually reach mutually beneficial conclusions. We can't have collectivity or solidarity if all we have is our vibes and affect.
There's, I guess, the similarity between a few of the things that you mentioned is that these are themes, names, theories within the academy that seem to masquerade as analysis, but actually create a block or create this undifferentiated space. There's a generation of young people, myself included, that were introduced to maybe the secondary and tertiary sources, but never actually got that education of the primary sources, the canon. Most of what we were taught was critiquing or debunking ideas that came before. And I think that goes a long way to explain some of the illiberal beliefs that have emerged in campus politics right now. How do you explain this rise of illiberal beliefs that's happened in the last few years?
I keep going back to this idea of the counterculturalists winning, in the institutions, and they succeeded. They became professors. They were very oppositional. There was a cultural break within the professoriate where
naloxone reverses an opioid overdose, even if you mispronounce it. For the record, it's naloxone. Na, like, is naloxone addictive? Nuh-uh. Lox, like naloxone keeps humans safe like locks keep bikes safe, and own, like naloxone can save lives in our very own communities. So let's head down to the pharmacy and pick up some over-the-counter naloxone. And if you forget the name, ask for the nasal spray that reverses overdoses. They'll know what you mean. Get informed at factsfightfentanyl.org, sponsored by the California Department of Public Health.
This younger generation that were emerging in the 70s were very sure of themselves and their rectitude, because the older generation wore tweed and, suits, and they were wearing jeans and listening to rock and roll. Like, there was a huge cultural break between, the great, the silent generation and the boomers sort of taking over academia, and they had a crusading attitude. Like, we're not racist, we're against the Vietnam War, we're anti-imperialist. They were maybe led by, their thought leader was Edward Said, Raymond Williams, people who were actually erudite. And then you have this generation of boomer cultural studies people who are like, you know what? We reject the canon. We come in with a political mission, and we are successful in academia. And so we are teaching the new young people a kind of enlightened set of enlightened field of knowledge. And we tell them that you don't have to read the canon anymore because it's heteropatriarchal, normative, and we can explore our feelings about stars. We can explore our relationship to popular culture. There really was a cultural revolution within academia, and in that cultural revolution, there was a fervor that these was increasingly successful cultural studies types were wielding like a red guard. Like, you read Shakespeare, you're a reactionary. I'm actually not the biggest Shakespeare fan, but let's say you read Marcel Proust, you like Samuel Beckett, you must be a reactionary because I just watch TV, or I love Survivor. I've written a book about Madonna. I want to read Lost. Like, there was an oppositionality and an antagonism that then created, I think, this crusading idea that transmits to younger people. Like, we're in a seminar, but we're actually on a crusade to destroy power. Like, I love the way that people use that. Like, we're dissecting power. That really
Right.
does come from Foucault. I'm sure
Right.
you heard about this.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like power is this trans-historical meta thing that.
That's what I was going to ask, is where do they think it comes from?
Where do they think power comes from?
Yeah.
Normativity. Or where do they think power comes? Like heteropatriarchal norms, the state, organizations. Like this animus against bureaucracy that Trump is exercising really has like deep roots in the libertarianism of left and right that realized itself through the past 50 years. So you have to distrust the man. You know, the hippies and don't trust anyone over 30, distrust the man. Like we've created this kind of antagonism that will say everything about power except capital, and will say everything about power's exercise over us except exploitation. For the right, it's like bureaucracy and institutions waste money. For the left liberals who, you know, come out of the Foucauldian school and also hate bureaucracy, bureaucracy is about, you know, standardization, alienation, and discipline.
You mentioned before the boomer left. There's this politics that emerges around the 1968 generation in which I would argue that left-wing ideas become kind of infused or woven into this kind of libertarianism.
Yeah.
What are some of the origins of that belief system? Because what it seems to have brought now is a kind of left politics that advocates for small business, which seems to be entirely ineffective.
There was a book called Small is Beautiful,
Right.
which was all about this kind of like hippie formations of communes versus organizations. It also comes out of, you know, this critique of organizations that actually was in business management. You know, the organization man was considered, you know, this guy went to work every day, was a conformist. It was part of the anti-conformity of that boomer left, thinking that, you know, there are oppressive organizations, and then there's this free-flowing small business, small scale, you know, Brooklyn rooftop farming thing that can save the world, right? Just don't join any large organizations. And this, okay, and the other thing that I'm really fascinated by, and is part of the trauma book too, is that among second wave feminists, the consciousness raising group was so critical and sort of turning like discontented housewives into feminists, right? And there was this mythical like aha moment where you'd be sharing with your girlfriends and suddenly you're like, aha, that's power. You know, I'm being taught all these things and I need to liberate myself from my domestic sphere and burn my bra and go out and experiment sexually and emotionally with other people, not my husband or my children. And so this kind of instantaneous feeling of enlightenment is better than the actual hard work of reason upon which the enlightenment is based, which is, you know, maturity, right? So you had second wave feminists telling women like, it's okay to regress, and because you're gonna free yourself from all these norms. The other thing that was happening in the 70s was this revival of mind cure thought and the New Age. And one of the things that people forget about the New Age and the hippies was that they really were sure that we were transitioning from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius.
The what?
What?
Okay.
The age of Pisces. Okay. The age of
Okay.
Pisces
Keep
was
going.
like a really oppressive age, was the age of Christ and disciplinarity. And sometime in the 60s, you know, end of the 20th century, you look pained. I'm sorry to be telling you this.
Keep going.
But it's you got to know these things, Joshua. But we were changing from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And in the age of Aquarius, it's the age of electricity, of connectivity, and eventually, like, even the internet. And so
I
then
was
we were all
educated
gonna
in Marxism, where it's these long, painful, boring equations that just rationally prove the extraction of surplus value. This sounds fucking insane. What are we talking about? We're talking about like constellations, or like.
Astrology. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you know how
Right.
the calendar goes, like Pisces, Aquarius.
I don't know, actually. I've never cared to learn this stuff. I'm sorry.
December, January is Pisces, and then we move to, I don't where are we now? Aquarius is like February, and Aquarius is about like loving and communication, and we're going to reach this alternative enlightenment. It's an alternative. Aquarius offers us an alternative to reason, to genital maturity, to even, normative forms of intersubjectivity, because we're just going to all connect. And the I shouldn't say the internet, this new communitarianism that was sort of the structure of the internet at the bottom of the California ideology is all about this instantaneous transformation.
Yeah.
Like no effort necessary
Right.
for the revolution. It's just going to happen. And, I'm sure that the boomer cultural studies profs would be like, we don't believe in astrology, but this was, like, I think their thinking. And when I look at the world that they've given us, there are all these departments that have, in anthropology especially, that have decolonizing the curriculum. Like our voluntary, we are so enlightened that we're going to go through the entire mass of human history and also human endeavor and just decolonize things one by one, so that when we click a little button, they'll be enlightened. Like this is colonial thought. We click a button, now it's decolonized. It's voluntarist, it's immediate, and it's gestural and performative in a way that makes us feel better about reading Franz Boas or Margaret Mead. And they had, terrible prejudices and biases. They didn't take anti-bias training, and we're going to, take the bias out of their work. So there's a kind of instantaneity that I'm talking about that's very similar to the culture of the internet. Like all of these things, have intellectual precedence. Like why do we want instantaneity so badly? It was this imagination that was already cultivated and created in the 60s and then the 70s, where you have this coming to you one day, it's like the red pill, black pill thing too. Like all you have to do is take a pill, really. You don't have to like think anything through, and you never have to change your point of view after you've taken the pill.
We've mentioned the Enlightenment a few times. Some of the ideologies that I see rising, coming into prominence in the last few years include theocracy, literally monarchy. People make arguments for things that are analogous to the caste system.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have a left that rejects the Enlightenment because it's somehow responsible for racism, colonialism, the tragedies of history, has all of this baggage that comes along with it.
Right.
How should the left understand its relationship to the Enlightenment?
For better or worse, the idea that all human beings are created equal, that reason and scientific method, replicable through experimentation and documented through a kind of mathematical, empirical observation of the world that other people can follow with regard to my logic, this kind of anti-mystical grounding, anti-religious, anti-propagandistic, anti-authoritarian idea of a subject who could engage with others in the world through reason, not mysticism, not subjugation. That idea, for better or worse, was hatched in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. There are material reasons for this. The bourgeoisie created enough leisure that there was enough people who were able to engage in philosophical thinking outside of the tutelage of the monarchs and the church. They were able to hide, beginning with Galileo, they were persecuted by the church. And then by the 17th century in France, Descartes was able to sort of give a deist cast to what he was really pioneering, which was the scientific method. And this moment, precipitates the violent overthrow of feudalism in France, and also the violent overthrow of the British Empire in the United States. This idea that all human beings are created equal, and that systems of oppression and belief are meant to enslave people in a state of what Kant called permanent tutelage, that we should all be freeing ourselves from this state of tutelage in order to be able to enjoy and participate in human progress and endeavor, which means the emancipation of the majority of human beings from both want, oppression, and exploitation. That begins, for better or worse, as a form of thought in Europe. We can stamp our feet and say, well, there are other forms of enlightenment. There are, what the fuck happened? But the scientific method that gave us electricity, that gave us the buildings, the possibility of building buildings this high, urbanization, along with its ravages, modernity was born in the 17th century in Europe. And there are many reasons we could think about this. That you could say that Protestantism and a certain form of, Jesuitical Catholicism was already on a secularizing trajectory.
Yes.
Right. So the thing now that people are rejecting, I think, is that in actuality, democratic forms and capitalism cannot coexist, and capitalism is eating democracy alive.
Right.
So a lot of young people, like my son, who's only grown up with the dysfunctional democracy, I think I saw the end of it. He'll say, like, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Democracy doesn't work. This is not working. And they feel attracted to a kind of authoritarianism, because the authoritarianism seems more obvious and naked exercise of power. Whereas, if you have people preaching to you about, let's use our reason together, and there's just all this fucking irrationality going on, especially in the left liberal spheres, then you just think, well, maybe we need to go back to strong top-to-bottom forms of rule, because democracy is just hypocrisy to younger people. It's fallen down. There's nostalgia for authoritarianism. I can understand that. The other thing is, pragmatically speaking, left organizations should be more structured and authoritarian, because we're not going to be just like aggregated little eggs trying to take down the system that we live in, because it doesn't provide. Organization actually provides stability, transmissibility of knowledge. I feel like every time there's a new organizational fervor on the left, we keep repeating the same mistakes, which were already described in that Joe Freeman article called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Yeah. If you haven't read it, you should really read it. And it's about how the women's movement ate itself up in the 1970s, where one day you're working for women's liberation, and the next day you're being canceled by a group of women who think that you're too male identified, or you're not a loyal enough member of the sisterhood. And every single left organization that I've seen comes to this point, at some point, where it becomes a purity politics. And I think it is the end point of a kind of crypto-religiosity. What puts that down is highly structured organizations. Extremely centralized exercise of power. And then you say, it's a dictatorship, we listen to your complaints, but there's no voting involved. So I think young people are legitimately questioning how democracy can function in a country where capitalism just eats democracy alive. Right now, the fact that Elon Musk has $500 billion at his disposal means that he has a weapon. It's like he has a nuclear weapon, and then the 330 million rest of us have sticks. And this is the thing about caring, is that at some point we have to get out of the humid, sentimental ideas about caring for helpless things and helpless people even, and think about how to build organizations with lasting power that can confront the obscene accumulation of wealth that's taking place today. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think that if you organized a protest now that really was powerful, I'm going to sound too conspiratorial, but the powers that will be, they'll come and put that down, either through infiltration, through physical threats. So there hasn't been a threatening figure like that since Bernie, and they put him down. They put down that movement really quickly. The other thing about the Enlightenment is that once you have an articulated reasoned, rational analysis of political economy, of the unconscious, of mental health, of childhood, of eroticism, of exploitation, it's very hard to silence it. Once it's been written, once it's been communicated, if you want to regress to irrationality, you have to fight really hard to repress the truth that is out there. And so, Freud wrote, the voice of reason is quiet, but it will not be silenced. And and I feel like all the irrationality of liberalism is being punished by Trump. You can't be that stupid and irrational and try to fool people as much as they did without some kind of karmic revenge, because there is I think, reason that we all share. This is the Enlightenment speaking. We all have a capacity to reason. We all share it. You can suppress it. You can, become a holy roller. You can join a cult. You can join Curtis Yarvin in his Nostalgia for Monarchy. But we all have a sense of logic. It's innate in human beings. And it will, at some point, explode. It will, at some point, react against irrationality, either violently, effectively, or ineffectively if it's not organized. But this was also such an important point for Marx, for Freud, for Kant, for the thinkers of the Enlightenment, which is that human beings are born equal, not because of who they are, but because of their shared capacity for reason.
Right.
Even the caveman who built, who hunted, or who built something, who tamed domesticated animals, who found tribal organizations that allowed for his clan to survive, or her clan to survive, they had to use reason at some point to become
What the fuck? Why is it so deep?
we as a species had to use our minds at some point to become the top predators of the earth because we are physically very weak, but we are mentally very strong. And God and tyrants and capitalism would like to take that away from us, but they can't really because the secret has been broken.
This kind of irrationality that has become, I think, prominent and mainstream on the left, I find this to be in contradiction with overcoming the market form of organization in society, that if one was to go about, let's say, economic planning or even high-speed rail, something like this, that would be a very deliberate, rational approach. And having lost that, I think we've kind of lost trace of this lineage. This is why I wanted to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment today, because Marx is scaffolded on top of the shoulders and the insights of Adam Smith, and Adam Smith before him, there is this school of thought called the Enlightenment. Where did the American left go wrong? Is this something that happened in the 90s? Is it something that happened in 1968, 1917? Did it happen in the 1700s? Like, where do we start to scope this problem?
When did the left start to worship irrationality? I think that's a good question.
Yeah.
And I think that the secularizing drive of both Freud and Marx to depose all gods and potentates and irrationality, that got stopped, I think, with the New Left, who began to worship irrationality as a form of oppositionality.
And when we say the New Left, what period are we referring
At the
to?
SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, becoming like more New Age, like 68 to 72.
Right.
But the other thing that's interesting about this moment is that it actually comes at a moment when there's massive redistribution of wealth from the top down. And there's a kind of middle class comfort that Americans haven't enjoyed before. And it's at this moment of like actual social democratic triumph that both capital needs to increase its rate of profit, and deindustrialization of the United States begins, and the outsourcing of heavy manufacturing to East Asia begins, and wealth starts to be redistributed back up through the 70s. But there's this kind of optimism, I would say, that and hubris that the New Left had, because it sort of assumed that there would be a stable middle working class alliance. And that was broken completely by Reagan, which also leads to, the confirmation of this left theory that social democracy itself is not stable.
Yes.
Right? Like, Social Security is a social democratic institution that the right wing right now wants to eat alive.
They're trying
and
to.
privatize, right? So it's a social democratic thing. And so if you really think about it, then it was always unstable because they were mad. The right was mad when it was established, and they've been like salivating over this large sum of money that we pay into so that we don't have to die in poorhouses. And they're thinking like, how this is just sitting there. Elon Musk called it a Ponzi scheme, which is either deliberate obfuscation or just like sheer stupidity.
I think it was a policy paper from the Cato Institute or something like that.
He's repeating.
Yeah. This, yes, social democracy is unsustainable in the long term, right? So there's this kind of problem of historical development where there's large profit margins at the beginning. You can redistribute this wealth into universal basic policies, social democratic infrastructure. And then after a certain point of development, necessarily austerity has to cut in and capital fights back against labor. And this is historically the problem of social democracy, that it kind of works for a limited period of time. That crisis of social democracy can kind of break in two directions. Either it can move towards neoliberal austerity, as it did in 1972 to 1980, or it can move towards economic planning, where you no longer need to use this price mechanism to organize society's resources. And so as we are encountering another period in which there may be certain forms of social democracy that happen in the advanced world, like I've heard it referred to as a green national security Keynesianism, this kind of resurgence of
yeah.
not quite New Deal politics, but things that more so resemble the New Deal liberalism that we were akin to before, the neoliberal period, that again, these opportunities to introduce forms of economic planning become possible.
Right.
Good luck telling that to anybody who was raised on the canon of 1968, though. There's this censorious trend that's kind of emerged in the last few years. Where do you attribute that to? Is that something that came out of the boomer generation, or
on the liberals?
on the liberal left? Yeah, particularly among elite educated professionals, among the college campus left. Is that something that happened in the 90s? Is it the 60s, or where does that start?
I don't know where it started, but to me it's very crypto-religious. It's all about excommunication. There's a doctrine, and the more powerful they became within liberal institutions, the more doctrinal error was not tolerated. So there are doctrines that have to do with like visibility, recognizability, centering marginalized voices, even though, we don't have, or land acknowledgments, or this mystical idea of identity giving you some kind of moral superiority over other people, that they really underwrote. And I feel like they're the doctrinal deviations from identity politics or wokeness, if you like, maybe even through recourse to a historical high liberalism, not to mention Marxism, that is just not tolerated.
Right.
This kind of intolerance is part and parcel of, what I was going to say is their power. It's like they've consolidated so much power, and they don't want to give up any of that power, even though skepticism was always, I think, a, kind of prime principle of liberalism. Like, I'm not going to take what you say at face value. I'm going to be skeptical. We'll argue about it. I trust that you won't lie to me, and I trust that you won't hate me if I disagree with you. But somehow, because we can't have universalism because of postmodern pluralism, we don't even believe in God, so all we believe in is doctrinal purity.
Yeah.
You know what leftists need to do? They need to grow up and have boundaries. And I am going to be like the Joni Peterson right now.
Okay.
It is not okay to be a little egg, Avatar. We have to treat ourselves and each other like adults, which means sometimes we'll be upset by the world. We will be upset by other people's opinions, other people's behaviors, and we have to treat ourselves and the other with respect, because we have to keep the idea of good social relations before we can even get to socialism. And good social relations means good boundaries. And this is why having a strong ego is actually critical to being a good political subject. Otherwise, you're divided like an egg between the superego and the id. Freud said the superego and the id are on one loop. The ego has to be a mediating term between them. So people, grow the fuck up.
Speaking of MAGA communism, we're in a situation where historic margins of working class people have voted for Republicans. This is something that's been growing over the last few years, but it's impossible to ignore now, even for the mainstream media. You mentioned before this kind of left liberal doctrine. It seems to resemble something of like a priest class. Our mutual friend Angela Nagel described some of this increasing margin of working class support for conservative right-wing populist parties as a kind of clerical rebellion. Does that analogy map to you? Does that make sense?
It does. But I don't know if it's clerical rebellion or popular blasphemy.
What's the difference between the two?
The clerical rebellion means like there's one part of the church that rebels against another part of the church. And I feel like the Republican Party is not really like, it's not devout or pious enough with liberal values. It just wants to encourage popular blasphemy. But I think it's important. I was like, this is a distraction. But right now, I think it's part of this irrationality. Of course, trans people should have civil rights, but why can't we call people mothers? Why, when my girlfriend was giving birth or going to birthing classes, prenatal education classes, they had to call mothers birthing people. This is in Brooklyn, 3 years ago. how did it get to that point where we couldn't use the word mother anymore? Didn't we think there would be a popular reaction against that bullshit? And it was totally doctrinal. And my friend said, she talked to some of these doulas and these, natal education people, and they were afraid of being canceled because they have, a presence online. That's how they get their business, midwives and stuff like that. So they were conforming to the liberal doctrine of Brooklyn that you couldn't actually say early childhood education for mothers, or birthing classes for mothers. It had to be birthing classes for birthing people.
How do we explain this historic margin of working class people voting for Republicans? Like, how much of that is culture wars, trans kids, like all of this kind of stuff, and how much of it is this kind of underlying crisis of, let's say, the Democrats abandoning labor as part of their coalition? Like, what proportionally makes up this historic shift?
So let's say we wanted to do we doubled down as liberals on identity politics, but we also fought for universal health care. We also fought for the breakup of monopolies. We also fought for minimum wage. Let's say we fought for both things with equal amounts of fervor, and we actually gave people concrete benefits that made them trust their government or their political policies, their political policies. Maybe that would have been okay. But the Dems pushed the language rituals without really having any stake in providing for working class and middle class people. Trump actually just wrote checks at the end of COVID. Biden stopped that. I mean, and there were certain things that people kept saying, like his Inflation Reduction Act did so much. They just had bad optics, bad communication. They should have told people how they were improving their lives. Maybe they actually weren't improving their lives. Maybe it wasn't just a PR stunt. But they pushed this other cultural program harder than they did the economic programs. Yeah. You know what I was thinking on my way over here? I was like, look at all these executive orders that Trump was doing. What if a Democratic president actually said, we're going to abolish insurance companies? They didn't do anything. We're going to have single payer. I'm going to do it by executive order. Because here's $1 billion company that's did not... the CEO of United Healthcare would still be alive. Luigi wouldn't have had to do what he had to do. And we'd have just said, no insurance companies. Executive order.
Yeah.
And we would have gotten all this pushback, but you'd have been saying, I'm on the side of Americans who've been exploited by their insurance companies. Why? And I want mothers to be called birthing people, which I would have still objected to, but it was like, I'm going to do this really powerful thing and take away this middleman that's adjudicating your health care for profit. That's, there's so many doctors that are angry about this, so many nurses that are angry about this, so many people who suffered like this. Who would be angry at you for punishing insurance companies? But they won't do it because their billionaire donors don't want them to. So they're just like puppets of a different kind of oligarch. I mean, because I was really thinking about that. Like, what kind of symbolic executive order could a Democratic president have made that would have galvanized people, even if eventually got whittled away and challenged in the courts, whatever? What if you just said, you know what, United Healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, you guys are no good. You're bad people. Like, talk like Trump. You're hurting people. You're horrible. You're doing crimes against America. I'm getting rid of you. And then everyone would be like, oh, no, but you're no, these guys are bad guys. The insurance companies are bad guys. You'd have at least 100 million Americans going, yes, you're on my side. And you're like, I'm on your side, people. These are bad guys. In an alternate universe, I see Luigi Mangione coming down the street, gunning someone down. Someone's going to get really mad at these insurance CEOs. What value do they provide? None. So let's just get rid of them.
On this topic of executive orders, this has been recently my hobby horse to discuss with people during Trump 2.0. There's a lot of criticisms on the left about this concentration of power in the executive branch, people calling Trump a dictator and so on. And I think to myself that, let's imagine some point in the future there's a candidate that you and I like, and we want them to pass sweeping policy reforms. We actually do want a very empowered executive branch that can do FDR-like transformations to the U.S. Is there something that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot with some of these critiques, this fear of power, fear of actually transforming the stuff of society?
I'm not shooting myself in the foot because
No,
I'm
we,
for that.
we on the left, I mean,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
generally, I think you and I would probably disagree with this, but I hear these criticisms
Yeah.
kind of bubbling up in the zeitgeist.
Everything is so procedural, right? They're so technocratic. He's not following the rules. I think that for
He's not following the rules, yeah. The rules that are written on paper, right? Is that okay?
he's just doing stuff. So this goes back to, I think, our idea to one of your questions about how democracy for younger people seems like it's a failed experiment, is that it's become completely processual. Like, it's all process-based.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
politics.
Mhm.
This is how David Plouffe and Quentin folks talked about the failure of the Harris campaign, too. It was all, like, technical. Their failures were technical, not political. Like, actually an executive order and a sovereign act on the part of the president is highly political. Like, he's doing things and he's changing the political realm. He's changing what we imagine possible through government. He's making people angry, making some people happy, and he feels that he is the expression of the popular will.
Yeah.
Because he won so many votes. Why did no Democratic president feel that way? Democratic presidents think they're the managers of constitutional procedure. But you know what? Actually, you could think of executive power as the expression of popular will. And now that all of Trump's executive orders are going to be challenged in courts, his followers are going to say those judges were appointed, they were not elected, like that. The courts are actually anti-democratic. But I feel like we right now have to push the limits of what executive power is for Trump to execute the will of the oligarchs. If one day we do get a progressive leader, someone's going to have to do that to thwart the will of the oligarchs.
Right.
But you cannot continue to be technocratic and depoliticizing and apolitical. One of the things that the Democrats are really good at doing is making people feel hopeless and demobilizing them politically.
I will not include this in the public version of the podcast, but my contrarian impulse here is that if one had to imagine organizing a national economy that contained 1,000 millionaires versus 10 billionaires, there are procedures, there are levers that can be used over a small group of people, like Jack Ma, for example. Like, if we have the neo-FDR that gets into office, like, we just put Elon Musk in prison for, like, 10 years. And you don't have to worry about taxing, 900 other people that are routing their capital through the Cayman Islands and using tax avoidance and whatever. It's like, it's just concentrated in one guy. That's a little bit of a lever there.
You're not going to put the. Well, I'll say that I totally agree with you.
A little too base, maybe, for the
public
version.
But I'll agree with you on this because I mean,
I'd put him in jail now. I wouldn't wait, but once we do have neo-FDR, like
neo-FDR,
immediately, overnight.
Right, just put it, yeah. And you know what? The other thing is, Jack Ma was never in jail. He was just sequestered. Like, this is what, because there's no habeas.
It's that easy.
There's no habeas corpus in China, or we don't need habeas on
Yeah, yeah.
But he was just probably like under house arrest and not told not to make public appearances for a while. So the thing that I thought was really interesting about this was that seeing what's happening now is that instead of having Jack Ma bribe the Chinese government scared the billionaires, as you said.
Right.
And now we have the billionaires exercising their will, or one billionaire at least. The others are scared, but exercising his will over Trump and collaborating with him. And in China, it's antagonistic. It's like,
okay.
And the government said, we let you make all this money. But in the end, we're still in charge of you. And that was, and you know what's crazy about that? Is that if you look at Chinese public opinion, they're like, yeah, you know what? He had too much money.
Yeah. No, it's like
they're
like,
not like,
no, it's
oh,
good.
Jack
Yeah,
Ma,
yeah.
I've been doing these ones recently where it's like until something of my some bodily organ. Yeah, pufferfish specifically.
That makes me so happy.
I know. I found this picture in your like photos or something, and then I used it, and then I've just been searching up pictures for the next ones.
Yay, that's very iconic.
But I'll end it now.